Hey guys, Jim here, and today we're kicking off our first video in the budget upgrade series on the WLToys 10428B. Today we'll be turning a lot of screws and playing with silly putty, so stick around. So today we're kicking off the first video in our upgrade series on the WLToys 10428B. If you're not familiar with this idea, make sure you check out my introductory video where we kind of go over the details. But to make it real short, we're going to have a $20 budget every week, and we're going to apply that budget toward upgrades on this vehicle with a total budget in mind, including the price of the vehicle of $250. With that in mind, the first thing we're going to do is take this vehicle right apart, and we're just going to go through it. With any ready-to-run vehicle, but especially some of the lower-priced ones, it's a really good idea just to open them up, look inside, make sure everything's there, everything's set up properly, the screws are tight, that your differentials are greased, and that everything just looks the way it should. It's not uncommon to take these vehicles apart and find missing bearings or screws that aren't tight or differentials that are dry. So that's going to be today's project, is to just tear this down. We're going to go right inside of the differentials, make sure they're well greased, grease them if they're not, and just make sure that all of the rest of the components and parts are here. While we have this apart, we're going to address one of this vehicle's shortcomings from a crawling perspective. As I mentioned before, this has an open front differential, which really helps it as a basher because you don't want to have those rollovers all the time in turns, but it really impedes its ability to crawl, which is how I intend to use this vehicle the most. So we're going to take some of the silly putty and we're going to pack it into the front differential. This isn't going to make it truly locked. It'll still give it a little bit of give and flex, which is probably a good thing because you don't want to start snapping axles if you get something bound up. You really want something to be able to give. This will offer enough resistance that in normal terrain under normal circumstances, it should behave like a locked differential. And the best part is that this is really cheap. You can get a 2-pack of these at Walmart for $2. This stuff is like crack, man. So that's going to be our total investment in this vehicle today. That way we can start to save some of our $20 weekly budget to build up towards some of the more expensive upgrades we're going to have in the future. So now what we're going to do is we're going to start taking this thing apart. And once we're inside, we'll start taking a look at how things look. So there's a lot of hardware between us and the inside of this vehicle. So now we're just going to start going through and taking it all apart. Okay guys, so what it boils down to is once you get the roof panel off, there's a couple of screws right in here that hold this cage to the rear shock tower. You also have the screws underneath that hold the cage to the body. And lastly, there are screws hiding in here that end up holding the battery tray right into here. So you've got to get that off as well. Once you do that, this body will flip right forward. If you want to take it off completely, there's just 2 more screws at the front of the body. So now that we're in here, there's a couple of neat things. Right on this shift servo, you can see that there's a piece of tape with some writing, and what this represents are the end points that were set at the factory in the controller for the movement of this shift servo. Right off the bat, when I tried this thing out, I could hear this servo buzzing a little bit, and so I had to reset the end points. So I've changed it from a 52%, I brought it all the way down to 23%. 23% throw on the controller still gives this enough movement to shift properly, but now the servo doesn't buzz. You want to shift this from first to second gear, and you're going to have to lift it up so that the wheels move a little bit just to fully engage. And you want to see how much movement it takes for it to engage. Dial your trim back until it doesn't move quite enough, and then just go back to where it was enough to fully engage. That should make sure everything's quiet with no buzzing. If this isn't set properly, you'll have that buzzing even with it fully engaged, and that's exactly what you're trying to avoid. That burns up the servos. So that's step 1. So now our next step is to take a look inside the rear differential, which we're going to get into just by taking these 4 screws out. Alright, so I've popped this cover off, and what you can see here is that just like I expected, this ring gear is completely dry. And of course, if the ring gear is dry, so is the pinion. So the first step is going to be to put some grease in here just to make sure that this stuff is well lubricated and doesn't have any undue wear. So therapeutic. Okay, so what I'm going to use is this super lube grease. Usually I'll use some sort of an axle bearing grease, but this happened to be nearby and it works just as well. So we're just going to go ahead and put a bunch of grease on that ring gear all the way around, and then we'll give it a few turns just to make sure it gets spread out real well. Okay, so that was a piece of cake. Now that we're all greased up, we can just go ahead and put this cover back on and we'll work our way to the front. So as I was putting this together, I found something that I wanted to point out, and this is always why it's important to check things out. Now, this drive shaft is held onto the rear pinion with the set screw, and it looks like it's supposed to have a set screw on both sides, but this one's missing. Now, I think it'll probably do just fine with one, but this is a perfect example of why you want to tear these vehicles apart. I'm going to go dig through my pile of stuff, see if I have one that fits, and if it does, I'll throw it in here. So now we're going to move on to the front differential. So in order to get to the front differential, there are 2 screws on the bottom here that you use to take this off. Then there are 2 more screws that are just holding this together. You pull this off. And once you pull that off, there are 4 small screws in this cover. And once you pull those screws, this will come right apart. Now, if you look, this does look like it's been greased. And I kind of had a suspicion because if you can see this, there's some wetness on the bottom of this that I saw underneath the vehicle. So I kind of had a feeling this one was greased, but it's more of an oil than a grease, and still not good enough. So you can get this out without pulling the wheels to get to the dog bones. And yeah, just a little bit of light oil on that, so we're going to go ahead and grease that up. But first we're going to get inside of this and take a look. Okay, so to get this apart, there are the 4 screws that are holding this diff cup to the ring gear. You take those off. You're going to need to take these bearings off, and just be aware that these are not a normal bearing, but they're a shoulder bearing. So you want to make sure that the bigger part of that shoulder is on the inside, or things won't go back together. So you can see inside of here, this looks like it was fairly well greased, which figures because this we want dry so that we can get our silly putty into it. So now the next step is going to be to clean this out really well and get it nice and dry. So in order to clean these out, you can use some soapy water, clean them up real well and let them dry. Or if you have like brake cleaner or carburetor cleaner or anything of that nature, those will help get you clean and dry a little bit faster. So that's what I'm going to do. Just go grab my brake cleaner. I'm going to clean these up and I'll be right back. Okay, so we're going to take a little bit of this stuff and we're going to try to get it worked up so that we can get it right down into there. And then we'll drop our first gear in. Drop our second gear in. Make sure you squeeze it real good so that those gears sit where they're supposed to. Now we're going to try to install this. Okay. And you can see that we've got that silly putty squished right in there. Now what I'm going to do is try to squish a little bit more in, and then we're going to put the lid on. So let's get a little bit more in there. So you can see we've got that, I think, pretty much as full as we're going to be able to get it. So now we'll just make sure our gasket is lined up. We want to get these screws started to ensure proper alignment. We don't want to use the screws to suck these together. We want to squeeze it nice and snug and then tighten our screws. Okay, everything's tight. We can see that we had a little bit of silly putty squeeze out. So now we just want to take a pocket knife or a toothpick and clean that up as well as we can. So once you cleaned up the silly putty, go ahead and put these bearings on, and like I said, make sure they're oriented properly. Get the super lube, lube up this ring gear real well. That way it'll mesh with the pinion, and your ring and pinion will be well lubricated. Now comes the balancing act of trying to get this re-engaged. Okay guys, when you're putting this cover back on, one thing you want to be careful of is that these are very small screws here, and it's not hard to strip the threads. So when you're tightening this, once you start to feel that resistance, you want to stop. If you overdo it, you're going to strip these, and we don't want that to happen. I think I'm going to have to go buy more of this stuff after I use it. So there you go guys, we were able to go through the vehicle, make sure everything's like it should be. We found that both of our ring and pinion sets were dry. We've got those greased up, and we got our silly putty and our front differential, which seems like it's going to work really well. Well guys, I had fun with this video. I hope you enjoyed watching it. I hope you learned something. And if you want to make sure you follow along with these upgrades, make sure you hit that subscribe button below. We're going to try to get one of these videos out every week until this is done. So stick around. Thanks.